The Zelensky regime in Kiev, I don't think he enjoys much legitimacy inside his own country anymore. He's widely hated, but he's also widely feared because of the Ukrainian secret police that threatens anybody that challenges Zelensky. If we are stupid enough to go into Western Ukraine, and I say we, I'm talking about NATO.
Right.
And, right now, I'm not even sure what NATO means. NATO is in a state of disarray. There is no leadership from Washington. But the point is, if they're dumb enough to go into Ukraine with the idea of positioning themselves in front of Odessa or something, they'll be destroyed. Yeah. Because right now, if you step 1 foot into Ukraine, the Russians know it. They have it under surveillance. They can target it. They can strike it. And they've demonstrated, not just with their hypersonic missiles, but all of their cruise missiles and tactical ballistic missiles and so forth, that there's nothing they can't reach.
Everyone, this is Colonel Douglas Macgregor, a 28-year veteran of the U.S. Army who previously served as the senior advisor to the U.S. Secretary of Defense. Colonel Macgregor is one of the few American voices who has been an outspoken critic of both the United States and NATO's involvement in the Russia-Ukraine war. He has some incredible insights that you will never hear in traditional Western media. The Russia-Ukraine conflict didn't start a couple years ago. This war has been ongoing for the past decade, and the only thing Western forces have done is strengthen Putin's military to now its strongest point since the 1980s. Meanwhile, what future is left for the people of Ukraine? Will NATO escalate this conflict into an all-out war that could turn nuclear with Russia? What does Putin really want with Ukraine, and how will this war actually end? We answer all of these questions and more in today's interview. Let's begin.
Well, everyone, I'm very honored to welcome back into the studio Colonel Douglas Macgregor. He is the CEO of Our Country, Our Choice. Colonel, thank you for being here today.
Happy to be here.
Absolutely. Colonel, I want to start today's conversation by talking about Russia and Ukraine. We're now entering the third year of this conflict, or I'd say the most recent conflict. Of course, if you study the history, it goes back much longer than that, really starting in 2014. But we're at a point now where there's a lot of minds that are speaking out about this. And I want to bring up a recent article from Stephen Walt, a very famous international relations professor at Harvard, who wrote this column I thought was interesting. NATO should not accept Ukraine for Ukraine's sake. And I want to follow that by a tweet that you had sent out. There's nothing in the NATO treaty that requires us to do anything in Ukraine. Wake up. Colonel, expand upon this. Tell us more about this.
Well, Stephen Walt's a very thoughtful and balanced man who's written a number of great books over the years. And he's right. This whole business about Ukraine is completely unnecessary. It really got off the ground in a major way in 2007 and 2008 after the NATO conference in Budapest. We made the decision back in the 1990s to expand NATO far to the east after we'd made solemn promises not to do so. So it was inevitable that we would end up in conflict with Russia. And that point was made clear by Ambassador Burns in Moscow under the Obama administration. He's the man who is now directing the Central Intelligence Agency. And he said, no means no. And if you push it to the limit, you're going to end up at war with Russia. President Putin, who initially wanted very much for Russia to join NATO, made these points clear again and again. So what happened was unfortunately made inevitable by our policies. Now, what's happening today? Let's put it this way. The Zelensky regime in Kiev, because I reject the notion that Zelensky is the popularly elected leader of Ukraine. I have serious doubts about that. I don't think he enjoys much legitimacy inside his own country anymore. He's widely hated, but he's also widely feared because of the Ukrainian secret police that threatens anybody that challenges Zelensky. He is now a fatally wounded animal. He's dying. His regime is dying. Ukraine is defeated. And as a result, he's striking out in any way that he can as a last gasp effort to, one, persuade people that there is some life left in his regime, two, that he could miraculously recover and win, and three, as a matter of personal vengeance for what he thinks is being done to him. Now, what does this amount to? Well, you just saw this terrorist attack in Moscow. These people were not jihadists. If anything, I would characterize them as mercenary thugs. They appear to be Tajiks, but there may be others from Central Asia. They just happen to be Muslim. They were promised a great deal of money if they would go to Moscow and commit this atrocity. The whole thing seems to have been rather haphazardly planned. However, they did find a cache of weapons inside the country that they were directed to. That smacks of CIA, MI6 work. They picked the weapons up, they went in, they committed the atrocity, and then stupidly got into the same vehicle they used to get there and then tried to take the same route back to Ukraine from which they came. Those are things that normally any capable insurgent or spy or espionage agent would never do. So, surprise, surprise, they were captured. The majority were captured on the way back in a forested area. One was captured early on. He's the one who is missing his ear. You may have seen that on the internet. The Russian authorities were very upset with the Spetsnaz organization when they discovered this man's ear had been cut off. It turns out the Spetsnaz group that went in and found these people were Chechens from General Kadyrov's organization. And when they were asked who had done this, everyone in the organization stood forward and said he had done it. So they were universally supporting each other in this effort. They're heroes inside Russia. No one is sort of expressing regrets over this man's ear, obviously. But this was not ISIS-K or any other chapter of ISIS, which is being blurted out by the State Department and the Department of Defense. It's all nonsense. So the bottom line is that Russia has tried very hard under President Putin's leadership to find a negotiated settlement. That has not worked. It has moved slowly and deliberately for two reasons. First of all, it doesn't want to sacrifice its own soldiers' lives needlessly. And secondly, they don't really want to kill very many Ukrainians, which has turned out to be a hopeless effort because, after all, they too are Orthodox Slavs. So there was no interest in killing these people. But at this point, more than 500,000 Ukrainian soldiers are dead. Maybe another 500,000 to 1 million are wounded. We don't know. We know the hospitals are full. We know they're overflowing. And the Ukrainian army, as it is in ruins. They're doing all they can to hold on to bits and pieces of terrain. The only reason the Russians have not moved further faster right now with the collapse, effectively, of the Ukrainian defense is that the ground won't support it. It's very, very muddy right now. Likely to remain so at least until the middle or end of April. But I predict that at that point, Russian ground forces will go forward to the Dnieper River. They'll probably close up the distance between where they are now and certainly Kharkov, maybe Kiev, and they'll certainly cross the river and take Odessa. Now, we don't see indications of those things yet, but if you look at the distribution of forces and how much military powers at their disposal, that's going to happen. Until then, we'll see more strategic missile strikes like the ones that happened over the weekend that basically blackened out 4 major cities in Ukraine by destroying the energy infrastructure. In other words, they're going to strike back all over the country, demonstrating, first of all, that if we are stupid enough to go into Western Ukraine, and I say we, I'm talking about NATO. And, right now, I'm not even sure what NATO means. NATO is in a state of disarray. There is no leadership from Washington. Macron is making ridiculous statements that his own population dismisses, but he seems to have pushed a few thousand French troops, largely Foreign Legion, into Romania. My sources inside the French Ministry of Defense tell me that the best they can do is about 7,700 troops that could be ready to fight in Ukraine. He's talking about 20,000. People are wondering where the rest will come from. But the point is, if they're dumb enough to go into Ukraine with the idea of positioning themselves in front of Odessa or something, they'll be destroyed. Because right now, if you step 1 foot into Ukraine, the Russians know it. They have it under surveillance. They can target it. They can strike it. And they've demonstrated, not just with their hypersonic missiles, but all of their cruise missiles and tactical ballistic missiles and so forth, that there's nothing they can't reach. Now, the Poles have toyed with doing stupid things in the past, but fortunately, their chief of staff has talked sense and said, we're not prepared to do this. You're talking about an area of the world that is enormous in size. And the notion that a few thousand troops are going to make any difference at this point is ridiculous. Finally, the notion that we could send anything over there, and we're sending a package, I think, of 300 million right now, is going to make any difference seriously on the ground is nonsense. So this war is, for all intents and purposes, over, but we are postponing an end because we don't want to admit that we've made terrible mistakes, that we grossly miscalculated. Nobody wants to stand up and say that. And frankly, the Germans, I think the Poles privately have said it. I know other NATO members have said it to Macron. If you think we're going to go in there with you, you're crazy.
Yeah.
They're not going to go. So the French are going to be standing there on their own, and we've made it clear we won't go in.
Yeah.
So the real question is, what are we all doing? Why
Yeah.
are we dragging this out? Because the people who are suffering most are the Ukrainians.
Absolutely.
And this latest stupidity, this atrocious attack in Moscow has done nothing but strengthen resolve and determination inside the Russian state, among its people, as well as its leadership, to crush Ukraine. President Putin, to his enduring credit, has been very deliberate, very, very slow in an attempt to avoid doing precisely that. He's not interested in, quote unquote, crushing Ukraine.
Right.
He simply would like to see it neutral and unthreatening to Russia.
Right.
But we don't want to talk to the man. And, there's a whole rhyme or reason for it, which is ridiculous, but maybe we can talk about that later. But right now, we just need to understand the war is over, and we need to end it formally for the benefit of the Ukrainian people.
Yeah, that's a powerful statement. And I just want to follow that up because you did send out a very interesting tweet that you had just mentioned. I just want to bring this up for the audience here, that Ukraine's losses in the conflict with Russia should be counted in the millions. This is the former chief of the Polish General Staff, and that Kyiv is losing the war and does not have the resources to sustain the fight against Moscow. That is quite the statement, and agreed. I mean, when we saw Macron came out and said that, we won't rule against putting NATO troops on the ground, it sended a really interesting signal. I mean, immediately the German chancellor came out and said, no, that's wrong. We have to, we're going to immediately denounce that. And it just does seem that NATO does not have a clear mission on what they're really trying to do. Some people here in the United States are saying, well, let's just get Ukraine. Let's give them a pathway to NATO membership, which is only going to make things worse. But, how is this going to end, Colonel? I mean, what is really the next step here, with Washington and how they're doing it? Are we going to be able to, turn the tides here and actually change our policies? Or is this just going to continue into an endless war that, as you said, is most devastating to the Ukrainian people?
Well, that's an important question. Let me answer it this way. Right now, inside the Beltway, you have a cabal of people that call themselves globalists. Now, we could spend a long time trying to figure out what globalism is all about, but effectively, it's about people who've decided to appoint themselves as God and determine how everyone everywhere should live. In other words, the LGBTQ plus whatever it is agenda, plus the destroy the family agenda, plus atheism agenda, all of these things bound up together that demand that the world genuflect and bow and pay tribute to them as the people with a monopoly on truth, justice, and, history. So they're in the business of denationalizing themselves. That's what they're doing here in the United States. That's what they've done in much of Western Europe. They wanted to gain control of Russia, denationalize it, strip it of resources, exploit it. This is the crowd that you're dealing with, and their view is that they represent this vague thing called the liberal international order, in which they call the shots and determine what is or is not just. Everyone who is outside of that liberal international order is, quote unquote, an authoritarian, as though there was anything democratic about what's happening in the West these days. Because if you stand up and challenge anything, you're immediately tarred as a racist, an anti-Semite, you name it, go down the list of epithets, and threatened with everything from loss of your bank account and income to jail time, depending upon where you are.
Right.
So they're hardly what I would call Democrats, but this cabal that is centered in Washington has at its head right now Biden and the leadership in the Senate, both Democrat and Republican. They're part of the uniparty. They're all behind this nonsense. And they want to ensure that they win. Well, the problem is they're losing everywhere. They have precipitated an enormous resistance to everything they want to do here at home, in Europe, and inside Russia, and inside the rest of the world. The rest of the world has said, forget it. We're not interested in adopting anything that you want.